Hey guys, tonight we step quietly through the dusty streets of ancient Rome, where the sun is just beginning to rise over stone buildings, busy markets, and narrow alleyways filled with the sounds of carts, merchants, and children, preparing for another ordinary day. Imagine yourself standing in a Roman neighborhood thousands of years ago, holding a small writing tablet while you walk toward a place that looks nothing like the schools you know today. Tonight, you're going to discover what ancient Roman schools were really like. The boring, exhausting, fascinating, and sometimes surprisingly strange reality of learning in one of history's greatest civilizations. And trust me, after hearing about the long hours, strict teachers, and uncomfortable classroom conditions, you'll probably be very grateful for your modern chair, your backpack, and the fact that your teacher usually doesn't carry a stick as part of the lesson plan, because you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. It's always amazing to imagine people around the world relaxing together while exploring the quiet corners of history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slowly step into the world of ancient Rome, where childhood is already beginning to feel very different from the one you understand today. There are no colorful classrooms, no bright posters covering the walls, no shelves filled with hundreds of books, and certainly no comfortable desks arranged perfectly in rows. Instead, education in Rome grows out of a much simpler and much harsher world. For a Roman child, learning is not just about gaining knowledge. It is about preparing for a role in society. From a young age, children are expected to understand what kind of life awaits them. Boys from wealthy families may one day become politicians, soldiers, lawyers, or public speakers. Girls may be trained for responsibilities inside the household, although some receive education depending on their family's wealth and beliefs. The idea of school itself is not something every Roman child experiences. Education is strongly connected to social class. A child from a powerful family may have access to private tutors, expensive books, and advanced lessons. A child from a poorer household may spend most of their early years helping their family survive, rather than sitting in a classroom. When you imagine Roman school, picture something much smaller than today's schools. A teacher might rent a small room near a busy street, set up a few simple seats, and begin lessons as children arrive. The sounds of the city would never completely disappear. Outside, merchants would shout, animals would move through crowded roads, and people would argue or negotiate nearby. Inside, a group of children would gather around their teacher, known as a magister. There might be no special school building at all. The classroom could be a corner of a shop, a rented space, or even an open area with only basic protection from the weather. The first stage of education was called the ludus literarius. This was where young children learned the foundations: reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. The word ludus might sound like something fun, but this was not a place filled with games and laughter. It was a serious environment where children were expected to memorize information and follow instructions carefully. A typical Roman student would begin by learning letters, one by one. The alphabet was repeated again and again until it became familiar. There were no printed worksheets or digital tools. Every word had to be carefully written by hand. Mistakes were common, and correcting them required patience. Students practiced writing on wooden tablets covered with wax. Using a pointed tool called a stylus, they carved letters into the soft surface. If they made a mistake, they could simply smooth the wax and try again. This simple technology allowed Roman children to practice without wasting valuable writing materials. Reading was often based on repetition. Children listened to words spoken aloud and repeated them until they remembered the sounds and meanings. Much of education depended on memory because books were expensive and not available to everyone. As you sit quietly imagining this classroom, notice the differences between their world and yours. The Roman student did not carry a backpack full of notebooks. They carried simple tools. They did not search the internet for answers. They depended on their teacher and their own memory. They did not have thousands of books within reach. Knowledge was something carefully passed from one person to another. Yet, despite these challenges, Roman education created some of the most skilled speakers, writers, and thinkers of the ancient world. The same system that seemed limited by modern standards helped produce people who shaped politics, philosophy, law, and literature for centuries. The morning continues outside. The streets become louder. The classroom becomes warmer. Children lean closer to their tablets as the teacher begins another lesson. Some students are eager. Some are tired. Some are probably wondering when the day will finally end. And as you slowly settle deeper into this ancient world, you begin to realize something important. Roman school was not just a place where children learned letters and numbers. It was a place where society tried to shape the next generation of citizens. The lessons were difficult. The environment was simple. The expectations were heavy. But every small child sitting inside that humble classroom was carrying the future of Rome on their shoulders. Long before a Roman child walked into a classroom, education had already begun at home. In ancient Rome, the first lessons were not taught by a teacher standing in front of a group of students. They were taught by parents, relatives, servants, and the everyday world surrounding the child. You wake up in a Roman house as the morning sunlight slowly enters through the open courtyard. The sounds of daily life have already started. Someone is preparing food, someone is cleaning, and somewhere nearby, a child is beginning another day of learning without even realizing it. For Roman children, childhood is not considered a completely separate stage of life like it often is today. Children are seen as future members of society, and every action, every conversation, and every habit is viewed as preparation for adulthood. A young Roman child learns by watching. They observe how adults speak, how guests are welcomed, how family decisions are made, and how people behave in public. These lessons are just as important as reading and writing. A wealthy Roman boy might spend his early years following his father and learning about family traditions. He watches how his father handles business, discusses politics, and speaks with other citizens. Through these observations, he begins to understand what is expected of him. The Roman family is built around strong authority. The father, known as the paterfamilias, holds great power over the household. His role is not only to provide but also to guide the next generation. A child's education is connected to family reputation, because a well-trained child brings honor to the household. You can imagine a young boy sitting beside his father, listening carefully as stories of ancestors are told. These stories are not just entertainment. They teach values, courage, loyalty, discipline, and respect for tradition. Roman society places enormous importance on memory. Children are expected to remember family history, religious customs, and moral examples from the past. A person's identity is closely connected to where they come from and what their ancestors achieved. For girls, childhood education follows a different path. Many girls learn skills connected to managing a household. They may be taught spinning wool, organizing servants, preparing clothing, and maintaining the responsibilities expected of a Roman wife and mother. However, it would be wrong to imagine that every Roman girl was completely uneducated. Some girls from wealthy families receive lessons in reading, writing, music, and literature. Certain educated women in Roman history became known for their intelligence and knowledge. Education in Rome is shaped by opportunity. Wealth changes everything. A child from an influential family may have private tutors who come directly to the home. A child from a modest family may have limited access to formal education. This difference creates two very different childhood experiences existing at the same time. One child might spend the morning practicing poetry with a personal teacher inside a comfortable villa. Another child might spend the same morning helping with family work, learning practical skills instead of academic subjects. Even among children who attend school, life is not easy. There are no long holidays designed around relaxation. There are no entertainment-focused classrooms. Learning is considered a serious duty. Roman parents believe discipline creates success. A child who learns obedience, patience, and endurance is believed to have a better chance of becoming a respected adult. You walk through the streets of Rome and notice children everywhere. Some carry small writing tablets. Some follow adults through crowded markets. Some play simple games in open spaces. Their lives are filled with a mixture of work, learning, and moments of childhood freedom. Games are still part of Roman childhood. Children play with dolls, small animals made from clay, balls, and simple toys. They race, compete, and create their own entertainment. But even during play, Roman society constantly reminds them that adulthood is approaching. A Roman child does not have the same idea of childhood that many people have today. There is less focus on protecting children from responsibility and more focus on preparing them for it. At a young age, children begin understanding social class, family duty, and their place in the world. They learn that their future depends not only on their own choices, but also on their family background. As evening arrives, you imagine a Roman child putting away their writing tablet after a long day. Perhaps they are tired. Perhaps they are frustrated by difficult lessons. Perhaps they are simply waiting for tomorrow's chance to play. But slowly, day by day, these children are being shaped. Their voices will one day fill the Roman Senate. Their decisions will influence families and cities. Their ideas will travel across an empire that stretches farther than they can imagine. The classroom has not yet begun. The formal lessons are still ahead. But the education of a Roman child has already started from the moment they open their eyes and enter the world around them. By the time you reach the next morning, the Roman streets are already beginning to wake. You step carefully over uneven stones as the first light spreads across the rooftops. Somewhere nearby, a donkey complains about being awake. A cart rattles over the road. A merchant lifts the wooden cover from his stall. And among all this ordinary noise, a small group of children begins moving toward a modest classroom. You follow them. They are carrying simple writing tablets, perhaps a stylus tucked into a fold of cloth. Their clothes are practical, their expressions mix between curiosity and tiredness. None of them has a bright school uniform. None carries a modern backpack. There is no large school building waiting at the end of the street. Instead, you approach something much more ordinary. This is the Ludus Literarius, the elementary school where young Roman children learn the foundations of literacy and arithmetic. The word ludus can mean a place of learning, but it can also have associations with training and practice. In this setting, the children are being trained for the demands of Roman society. You pause outside. The classroom is surprisingly simple. Depending on the time and place, the teacher may have rented a small space along a busy street, or worked in an area attached to another building. There is no special architecture announcing that this is a school. The city simply continues around it. People walk past. Animals move through the streets. Merchants call to customers. And inside, the teacher tries to make himself heard. You enter quietly. The first thing you notice is that there are no neat rows of modern desks. The children may sit on stools, benches, or whatever simple seating is available. Some may stand while practicing. The arrangement is practical rather than comfortable. At the front is the teacher. The magister is responsible for teaching the children basic skills. He is not necessarily a wealthy or powerful man. In Roman society, teachers can occupy a relatively modest position, particularly when compared with the elite families whose children they educate. Still, inside this little classroom, the teacher possesses authority. The children know that. You can see it in the way they settle down when he begins speaking. The lesson starts with letters. A child receives a wax tablet. The teacher demonstrates a letter, and the student copies it. The process is repeated again and again. There is something wonderfully repetitive about it. Stroke. Pause. Check. Erase. Try again. The wax surface makes this possible. If a letter is wrong, the child can smooth the wax and begin again. It is an ancient version of practicing on a reusable surface. But patience is essential. A Roman child cannot simply press a button and erase an entire page. Every movement of the stylus matters. The teacher watches carefully. You imagine how strange this would feel if you had grown up with modern technology. There are no printed worksheets. There are no pencils in dozens of colors. There is no computer displaying an alphabet lesson. There is only a tablet, a stylus, a teacher, and a child trying not to make the same mistake for the 10th time. Reading comes slowly. The students learn letters, then syllables, then words. They hear sounds repeatedly and memorize patterns. Reading aloud is important because much ancient education depends on the relationship between spoken language and written language. The classroom is filled with quiet voices. One child repeats a word. Another struggles with a line. The teacher corrects them. Then they try again. You begin to understand that ancient education is built heavily around repetition. Memorization is not merely one technique among many. It is one of the central tools available to students. There are no enormous libraries available inside the classroom. Written material is expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Every scroll must be created by hand. This makes books valuable objects rather than disposable learning materials. So the teacher becomes extremely important. He carries knowledge in his memory and voice. The children listen, they remember, they repeat, and slowly, knowledge becomes part of them. Arithmetic enters the lesson as well. Roman children need practical mathematical skills. They may eventually use numbers in business, trade, household management, taxation, or other everyday activities. But Roman numerals are not exactly designed to make everything easy. You stare at the symbols and imagine trying to perform calculations without the familiar decimal notation and written methods you know today. Roman mathematics can involve counting boards, fingers, and other practical techniques. Students must develop their own familiarity with numbers through repeated practice. For a young child, this can be tiring. The classroom becomes warm. The street outside becomes louder. The teacher continues, and the morning stretches onward. You notice something else. Not every child in the room necessarily has the same level of ability. Some learn quickly. Others need more repetition. Some have already received lessons at home. Others may be encountering formal instruction for the first time. The teacher has to manage all of them. There is no standardized digital curriculum. No automated test tells him which student needs extra help. He relies on observation. He listens. He watches. He corrects. He repeats. And sometimes he becomes impatient. Roman educational culture places a strong emphasis on discipline. Children are expected to pay attention and obey. The classroom is not designed around keeping everyone entertained. In fact, entertainment is not really the point. You may find yourself wondering whether the children enjoy school. The answer probably varies. Some undoubtedly enjoy learning. Others probably enjoy the moments when the lesson ends. And that feeling is surprisingly timeless. Even 2,000 years ago, there were likely children watching the sunlight move across the wall and wondering how much longer remained before they could leave. The teacher continues his lesson. Outside, Rome continues its own. The contrast is fascinating. Beyond the classroom walls lies one of the largest and busiest cities of the ancient Mediterranean. Inside this modest room, a handful of children are quietly learning the skills that will allow them to participate in that world. A letter becomes a word. A word becomes a sentence. A number becomes a calculation. A simple lesson becomes part of a child's future. You look around once more. The classroom is not impressive. There are no grand columns, no enormous statues, no elaborate decorations. Yet this humble space represents something important. Rome understands that knowledge can be passed from one generation to another. And here, in a small room beside a noisy street, that process happens every morning. You slowly step back outside. The city air feels warmer now. The sounds of Rome surround you again. But behind you, the lesson continues. Another letter is written. Another word is repeated. Another Roman child leans over a wax tablet and begins practicing the tiny marks that will eventually open an enormous world of written language. And tomorrow, you will return to that classroom to see what the teacher expects from these children once the first excitement of learning has disappeared. By the next morning, you already know the way. You follow the same narrow street, passing the same worn stones and crowded stalls, until the modest classroom appears again beside the noisy road. This time, you enter more slowly. You want to understand the person standing at the center of this entire little world, the teacher. In Roman society, the magister is the person responsible for guiding young students through the first stages of formal education. He is not surrounded by the prestige that later philosophers or famous rhetoricians might enjoy. His classroom is humble, his equipment is basic, and his students are not always easy to manage. Yet for several hours each day, he controls the room. You watch him prepare. There is no elaborate lesson plan printed on paper, no projector, no stack of colorful textbooks. His most important tools are his voice, his memory, his knowledge, and the writing materials available to him. The children settle down. The teacher begins. His voice has to compete with Rome itself. Outside, carts roll over stone. People call to one another. A merchant argues about the price of something. Somewhere nearby, an animal makes a sound that seems determined to interrupt the entire lesson. The teacher continues anyway. He calls on a student. The child stands. A question is asked. The student answers, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. The teacher corrects the mistake and moves on. You begin to notice that the Roman classroom depends heavily on repetition. A lesson is spoken. The students repeat it. Then they write it. Then they hear it again. The process can feel endless. But there is a reason for this. In a world where books are expensive and information cannot simply be searched for, memory is incredibly valuable. A Roman student needs to carry knowledge inside their own mind. So the teacher makes them repeat, and repeat, and repeat. If you were sitting here for several hours, you might start wondering whether the Romans had invented the ancient equivalent of the phrase, "Write it down one more time." The answer, in spirit, is probably yes. The teacher also watches the students closely. He notices who is paying attention. He notices who is falling behind. He notices who is whispering. He notices who is staring toward the street. And there is always at least one child who seems more interested in what is happening outside than in the lesson. You can almost imagine the teacher looking directly at him. The child immediately looks back at the tablet. For a moment, the classroom becomes perfectly quiet. Then the lesson continues. The teacher's relationship with the students is shaped by Roman ideas about authority and discipline. Children are expected to respect adults, especially those responsible for their education. This does not mean every teacher is loved. In fact, ancient writers sometimes mention teachers with a mixture of humor and criticism. The profession could be tiring and poorly rewarded compared with more prestigious occupations. A teacher might work long hours and depend on fees from families. That means the classroom is also a small business. The teacher needs students. Families need to believe that the teacher is worth paying. And children need to keep attending. It is a surprisingly familiar arrangement. You look around the room and notice how different the students can be. Some come from wealthy families. Others come from more modest backgrounds. The exact composition depends on the location and circumstances, but formal education is generally more accessible to families who can afford to spend time and money on it. The teacher therefore occupies an interesting position. He may educate children whose families have much greater wealth or social status than he does. Inside the classroom, however, his knowledge gives him authority. For a few hours, everyone has to listen. The teacher moves toward a student's tablet. He points to a letter. The student has shaped it incorrectly. The teacher demonstrates the correct form. The child tries again. You watch the stylus move slowly across the wax. The mistake disappears. A new letter appears. This tiny action captures something important about ancient education. Learning is physical. The student does not simply absorb information by looking at a screen. They use their hands. They repeat movements. They hear sounds. They speak words. Knowledge enters through several senses at once. And because writing materials are limited, practice has to be efficient. Wax tablets are especially useful because they can be reused. The teacher can ask students to practice a passage, inspect their work, and then have them smooth the wax for another exercise. It is simple, it is practical, and it works. But not every lesson happens at the tablet. Sometimes the teacher speaks. Sometimes students recite. Sometimes they memorize. Sometimes they answer questions. The classroom constantly shifts between listening, speaking, writing, and remembering. As the morning continues, the teacher introduces another exercise. The children begin reading aloud, one after another. Their voices rise and fall. Some students are confident, others hesitate. The teacher corrects pronunciation and encourages them to continue. You realize that reading in the ancient world is deeply connected to speaking. A text is not merely something silently consumed. It is something heard. Words have rhythm. Sentences have structure. And the ability to read aloud clearly will later become important for students who move into higher levels of education. For now, though, the children are still learning the basics. Letters, words, numbers, memory, discipline. The teacher continues. Hours pass. The sunlight shifts. The classroom becomes warmer. The street outside grows louder. And still, the lesson goes on. Eventually, one child becomes restless. He shifts on his stool. He looks at another student's tablet. The other child notices. For a moment, both are trying not to laugh. The teacher notices too. The room goes silent. You can almost feel every student waiting to see what happens. The teacher says something firmly. The children return to their work. No modern classroom management system is needed. The authority of the teacher is immediate. But behind all this strictness, there is also an important purpose. The Romans believe education should shape character as well as knowledge. A student should learn patience, attention, self-control, respect, memory. These qualities are considered useful for adult life. A Roman citizen may one day need to speak before others, manage property, conduct business, participate in public affairs, or raise a family. The classroom is preparing them for that future. You look at the teacher again. He may never become famous. No statue may be built in his honor. No enormous monument may remember his name. Yet every day, he teaches children who will carry his lessons into the wider world. The Roman Empire is built not only by generals and emperors. It is also built quietly by teachers sitting in small rooms beside noisy streets. A letter taught today may become a word tomorrow. A word may become a sentence. A sentence may become a speech. And eventually, the child sitting nervously on a wooden stool may become an adult whose voice carries much farther than this classroom ever could. For now, though, the teacher simply gathers the children's attention and begins another exercise. The styluses move. The wax tablets fill. The street continues outside, and the ordinary Roman school day quietly rolls onward. The next morning, you return to the classroom with the faint feeling that you already know what awaits you. The same stone street, the same narrow doorway, the same wooden stools, the same wax tablets waiting for small hands. But today, you are going to pay attention to the smallest details. Because for a Roman child, learning to read and write is not one single lesson. It is a long process of repetition. You sit quietly near the back of the room, as the teacher places a tablet before one of the younger students. The child looks down. The teacher begins with the alphabet. One letter, then another. The student repeats each sound, again and again. You can almost feel the rhythm settling over the room. Roman children must become familiar with the letters of the Latin alphabet before they can begin reading more complicated material. They learn the shapes of letters, their sounds, and eventually how those letters combine into words. But remember where you are. There is no printed alphabet chart hanging on the wall. The teacher has to demonstrate the letters. The student has to copy them. And memory does much of the rest. A small wooden tablet covered with wax becomes the student's practice surface. The stylus moves. A line appears. The child looks at it. Something is wrong. The wax is smoothed. The letter disappears. The child tries again. You watch this happen several times. It is slow. It is repetitive. And it is strangely calming. There is no rush, no glowing screen, no notification interrupting the lesson. Only the quiet scratching of a stylus. The teacher walks between the students. He checks their letters. Some are too large. Some are too narrow. Some are uneven. He corrects them. The children try again. Once they become more comfortable with individual letters, they begin combining them. Sounds become syllables. Syllables become words. And words begin to form sentences. Reading in the ancient world is often connected with speaking aloud. The teacher may read a passage, and the students repeat it. You hear the children's voices moving around the room. At first, they sound uncertain. Then gradually, the words become smoother. The teacher listens carefully. He knows that a student who can recognize a word but cannot pronounce it properly still has more work to do. So they repeat. The same passage, the same sounds, the same difficult combination of letters, again. You begin to understand why ancient education can feel so demanding. It requires patience. There is no shortcut. The student must build the skill piece by piece. Now the teacher changes the lesson. Numbers. The children put aside their reading practice and begin working with basic arithmetic. This is another essential part of education. Roman society depends heavily on counting. Merchants need numbers. Households need numbers. Builders need measurements. Administrators need records. Soldiers receive supplies. Taxes are calculated. Goods are bought and sold. A child who can work with numbers has gained a practical skill that can be useful throughout life. But Roman numerical notation is different from the system you are accustomed to. Roman numerals are based on symbols such as I, V, X, L, C, D, and M. You probably recognize them immediately. But imagine being a child encountering them for the first time. You have to remember what each symbol means. Then you have to understand how different combinations work. The teacher writes an example. The children copy it. Then they practice. For simple calculations, they may also use counting devices such as an abacus or counting board. You watch the teacher move small markers across a surface. One group, then another. The students follow. Numbers become physical. They can be moved, counted, grouped, separated. The teacher gives another problem. A child begins calculating. The classroom becomes quiet. Everyone waits. The answer is given. Sometimes correct, sometimes not. The teacher explains again. The teacher explains again and again. This process may sound dull, but in a world where arithmetic is woven into everyday survival and commerce, these lessons matter. A Roman child is not learning numbers simply to pass an examination. They are learning skills that may eventually be used in the real world. You imagine a student years later standing in a marketplace, checking the amount of grain being sold. The lesson from this little classroom is still there. Count carefully. Check the numbers. Do not make careless mistakes. The teacher continues. Now comes another challenge. Memory. The children are expected to remember what they have learned. The teacher may ask them to recite letters, words, or passages without looking at their tablets. This feels much harder. The children look upward. One boy hesitates. A girl answers confidently. Another child whispers the beginning of the passage under their breath. The teacher waits. The room is quiet. Then the answer arrives. You begin to appreciate how important memory must have been in ancient education. Written information exists, but access to it is limited. A modern student can carry an enormous amount of information in a small device. A Roman student cannot. If they want knowledge available whenever they need it, much of that knowledge has to live inside their own memory. So memorization becomes a daily exercise. The teacher asks questions. The students answer. He repeats the material. They repeat it again. Knowledge is slowly carved into memory, just as letters are carved into wax. The morning continues. The youngest students remain focused on basic skills. Older students may already be moving toward more complicated reading and writing. Education is not identical for everyone. Age matters. Family wealth matters. Ability matters. Future expectations matter. But the basic foundation remains the same. Letters, words, numbers, memory. The classroom feels almost timeless. A child sits with a tablet. A teacher explains a concept. Another child makes a mistake. Someone corrects it. The lesson continues. You look down at the wax tablet in front of you. It is an incredibly simple object. Yet with this little piece of wax and a pointed stylus, a child can practice the foundations of literacy. There is something almost beautiful about that simplicity. The tablet does not need electricity. It does not need a battery. It does not need an internet connection. It simply needs a hand, willing to practice. And that practice is repeated day after day. Eventually, the shapes become familiar. The numbers become easier. The words begin to make sense. A child who once struggled to recognize a letter can eventually read an entire passage. That transformation does not happen in one afternoon. It happens through hundreds of small attempts. One letter, one word, one number, one correction, one more repetition. The teacher looks across the room. The students continue working. Outside, Rome is busy with trade, politics, religion, construction, and ordinary daily life. Inside this little classroom, however, the world has become much smaller. There is only wax, wood, letters, numbers, and the patient process of learning. As the afternoon light begins to soften, you realize that the most important lesson of Roman elementary education may not have been any particular alphabet or calculation. It was endurance, the ability to keep trying when something did not make sense, the willingness to repeat a task until it became familiar, the patience to learn slowly. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, the scene still feels strangely recognizable. The tools have changed. The buildings have changed. The language has changed. But a child sitting at a desk, making the same mistake again and again while a teacher says try it once more, is not entirely an ancient idea. The Roman classroom becomes quieter. The final tablets are checked. The children begin gathering their things. Another day of letters and numbers is nearly finished. But tomorrow the wax tablets will be ready again. The next morning, instead of following the children immediately into the classroom, you stop for a moment and look at what they are carrying. There is not much. A small wooden tablet, a stylus, perhaps a scroll for an older student. That is nearly the entire portable school kit. No backpack stuffed with notebooks, no pencil case overflowing with supplies, no stack of brightly colored books. The simplicity is almost surprising. You enter the classroom and watch one of the children place a wooden tablet carefully on a bench. This little object is about to become the center of the lesson. The tablet is usually made from wood and has a recessed surface covered with wax. The wax creates a smooth writing surface that can be scratched with a pointed stylus. The stylus is usually made from metal, bone, or another suitable material. One end is pointed. The other can be flattened or shaped so that the wax can be smoothed. You watch the teacher demonstrate. He holds the stylus between his fingers and gently presses the point into the wax. A line appears, then another. A letter begins to form. The children watch closely. This is their writing technology. It is simple, reusable, and surprisingly effective. If a student makes a mistake, the wax can be smoothed. The writing disappears. The tablet is ready again. You imagine how valuable this would be in a world where writing materials are not cheap. Papyrus exists, especially in Egypt and throughout the Roman world, but it requires production, transportation, and careful preparation. Parchment is another writing material, but it too can be valuable. For everyday practice, wax tablets are extremely useful. They allow students to make mistakes without wasting a precious sheet. You watch one child write a line. The teacher checks it. The child smooths the wax. Another attempt. This simple cycle probably happens countless times during a student's education. Write. Erase. Write again. The process is almost meditative. But the tablet is not only useful for children. Wax tablets can be used for notes, temporary records, calculations, and everyday writing. The same basic technology belongs to a much larger world of Roman communication. You look at the stylus again. It seems almost too small to be important. Yet the stylus is the instrument through which the child learns to control written language. The movement must be precise. Too much pressure creates a deep mark. Too little pressure creates a faint one. The child has to learn control. The fingers become trained. The hand becomes familiar with the shapes of letters. Writing is not simply a mental skill. It becomes a physical skill. The teacher notices this. He corrects the student's posture. He demonstrates how to hold the stylus. He shows the direction of the strokes. Then the child tries again. You can almost hear the faint scratching sound. It is one of the defining sounds of the Roman classroom. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. Outside, the city continues. Inside, the letters slowly take shape. Now you notice another object. A small counting board. It looks less impressive than the marble architecture elsewhere in Rome, but it has an important purpose. Numbers can be represented using movable counters. The teacher places them into different positions. The children watch. One group represents one amount. Another group represents another. The counters are moved. The calculation changes. This makes arithmetic physical and visible. Instead of imagining numbers entirely in their heads, students can manipulate them with their hands. You watch a child move one marker, then another. The teacher asks for the total. The child counts. The answer comes. This is basic mathematics, but the principle is powerful. Numbers become objects that can be organized. The classroom has become a small laboratory of memory and movement. The children are learning through their eyes, their ears, and their hands. There are also writing surfaces that belong to more permanent forms of work. As students advance, they encounter papyrus, parchment, and other materials. But these are not necessarily as convenient for constant practice. A sheet of papyrus is valuable. A scroll can contain a substantial amount of writing, but it is not something you want to waste while learning how to form a letter. So the wax tablet remains extremely practical. You look at a child who has just finished a difficult exercise. The tablet is covered with marks. Some are neat, some are crooked, some have already been smoothed away. The surface contains the history of the lesson, even though most of it will soon disappear. There is something strangely beautiful about that. The student works hard. The mistake is erased. The lesson continues. Nothing needs to remain permanently visible for learning to happen. The teacher moves through the classroom. He checks each tablet. Sometimes he praises a student, sometimes he corrects them. Sometimes he simply moves on. The tools are simple, but the expectations are not. Children are expected to become comfortable with writing, reading, numbers, and memory. The materials help them get there. You begin to realize that Roman education is full of practical compromises. The Romans do not have modern mass-produced school supplies. They use what their society can produce: wax, wood, metal, papyrus, parchment, clay, stone, and the human voice. The teacher himself is one of the most important tools in the classroom. He reads. He speaks. He demonstrates. He remembers. He corrects. The students imitate him. In this environment, education depends on relationships as much as objects. A tablet alone cannot teach a child to read. A stylus cannot explain a difficult word. A counting board cannot decide whether an answer makes sense. The teacher has to bring everything together. As the day continues, you watch the children move between different activities: writing, reading, counting, memorizing. The classroom never becomes technologically impressive, but it becomes intellectually busy. One student writes, another reads, another counts, another repeats a passage from memory. The teacher moves among them. The simple tools create an entire educational system. You look once more at the wax tablet. It is almost comically ordinary. Yet without objects like this, countless Roman children would have had far fewer opportunities to practice writing. And through repeated practice, some of these children will eventually move beyond elementary lessons. They will encounter longer texts, more complicated grammar, literature, public speaking, perhaps philosophy, perhaps law. But it all begins here, with a piece of wood, a layer of wax, and a pointed stylus. The afternoon arrives. The teacher has to bring everything together. As the day continues, you watch the children move between different activities: writing, reading, counting, memorizing. The classroom never becomes technologically impressive, but it becomes intellectually busy. One student writes, another reads, another counts, another repeats a passage from memory. The teacher moves among them. The simple tools create an entire educational system. You look once more at the wax tablet. It is almost comically ordinary. Yet without objects like this, countless Roman children would have had far fewer opportunities to practice writing. And through repeated practice, some of these children will eventually move beyond elementary lessons. They will encounter longer texts, more complicated grammar, literature, public speaking, perhaps philosophy, perhaps law. But it all begins here, with a piece of wood, a layer of wax, and a pointed stylus. The afternoon arrives. The children begin packing their few belongings. There is no complicated process. The tablet is carried away. The stylus is tucked safely aside. Tomorrow, the same tools will return. The classroom will be ready, and the cycle will begin again. You step outside as the Roman evening approaches. The street is still busy, but somewhere behind you, a child is carrying a small wax tablet home. It may look insignificant, yet that little tablet represents one of the most important things a civilization can pass to its next generation: the ability to write down what you know, the ability to remember what others have taught you, and eventually, the ability to leave your own words behind. By now, the rhythm of the Roman school day has become familiar. You wake before the streets become completely crowded. You walk through the same narrow roads. You hear the same carts rolling over stone. And eventually, you reach the classroom just as the first students begin arriving. But today, instead of watching individual lessons, you are going to follow the entire day from beginning to end. So imagine that you are a young Roman student. The morning begins early. There is no need for an alarm clock. The city itself provides one. Doors open. Animals move through the streets. Merchants begin preparing their stalls. Workers call to one another. The sound of Rome slowly becomes louder until sleeping is no longer an option. You rise, wash, eat something simple, and prepare for school. Your school supplies are modest: a wax tablet, a stylus, perhaps another writing surface if your family can afford it. You leave home. The walk to school becomes part of your daily routine. Depending on where you live, the journey might be short or surprisingly complicated. Roman streets can be crowded and uneven. You pass people carrying baskets. You pass shopkeepers arranging goods. You pass public buildings and private homes. You hear conversations in the street. The city is already awake. Eventually, you reach the classroom. The teacher is preparing. Some students are already seated. Others arrive one by one. There is no grand ceremony, no school bell. The lesson simply begins when the teacher decides it is time. You sit down. The first subject is often reading and writing. The teacher begins with letters or words appropriate to the student's level. You take your wax tablet. The stylus feels familiar in your hand. The teacher demonstrates. You copy. The room fills with the quiet scratching of styluses. For a while, everything is focused. Then the teacher asks students to read. One child stands. He reads. Another follows. The teacher corrects mistakes. You wait for your turn. When it comes, you begin. Your voice sounds strangely loud in the small room. The teacher listens. You finish. He gives a brief correction. You sit down. The next exercise begins. There is no long break every hour. The lesson continues. After reading and writing comes arithmetic. The teacher brings out a counting board. The students begin working with numbers. You move counters. You count. You check. You calculate again. The morning feels long. The sun climbs higher. The classroom becomes warmer. You begin noticing the noises outside more than before. A cart passes. Someone shouts. A dog barks. The teacher continues speaking. You try to concentrate. Eventually, there may be a short pause. You leave the classroom. The street feels brighter now. Other children are outside. You stretch your legs. Perhaps you talk with a friend. Perhaps you play a quick game. Perhaps you simply enjoy not having to listen to a teacher for a few minutes. Then you return. The second part of the day begins. Depending on the age and level of the students, the lesson may involve more reading, memorization, or writing practice. The teacher may introduce a passage. You listen carefully. Then everyone repeats it. Again and again. The repetition is tiring, but the teacher expects you to remember. You close your eyes for a moment and try to recall the words. The teacher asks a question. You answer. Another student answers. The lesson moves forward. For a Roman child, this process is not simply academic. It is training in attention. You are expected to sit still. Listen. Remember. Speak when called upon. Work when instructed. These behaviors are considered important for adulthood. The day continues. If your family is wealthy enough, you may have additional instruction beyond this basic level. But for now, you remain in the elementary classroom. The teacher gives another writing exercise. You press the stylus into the wax. Your hand is tired. The letters are less neat than they were earlier. You correct one. Then another. You begin to wonder how many times a person can write the same word. The answer, apparently, is quite a lot. The afternoon light enters at a different angle now. The classroom has changed. The morning brightness is softer. The shadows are longer. The teacher's voice has become familiar background sound. Some students remain focused. Others look tired. The teacher continues. Eventually, the final exercise begins. You are asked to recite what you learned. You try to remember letters, words, numbers. The teacher listens. A few mistakes appear. He corrects them. You try again. This time, you succeed. The day is almost over. There is something satisfying about finishing. You place the stylus beside the tablet. The teacher looks across the room. The students begin gathering their things. The school day ends without ceremony. No bell rings. No announcement echoes through the building. You simply leave. Outside, Rome feels different. The streets are still busy, but the light is fading. You walk home carrying the same little tablet you carried in the morning. It seems almost strange that such a simple object could have occupied so many hours. But that is the nature of Roman schooling. Small tasks repeated over long periods. The education is built slowly. A letter learned today, a number remembered tomorrow, a passage recited next week. Over time, these tiny pieces become a foundation. As you walk home, you pass older children. Their education is becoming more advanced. Some are heading toward lessons in grammar. Others may eventually study rhetoric. You are reminded that the Roman educational journey does not necessarily end with the basic classroom. For some students, this is only the beginning. But for now, you are simply tired. You return home. Perhaps your family asks what you learned. Perhaps you show them your writing. Perhaps you eat and rest. The tablet is placed somewhere safe. Tomorrow, it will come with you again. And the cycle will repeat. The same street. The same classroom. The same teacher. The same stylus. The same letters, the same numbers. At first, the repetition might seem boring, but repetition is exactly how the Romans build skill. A child does not become literate in one remarkable moment. They become literate through hundreds of ordinary mornings, and as you lie down that evening, you realize that the Roman school day was not filled with spectacular events. There were no dramatic discoveries. No exciting experiments, no flashing demonstrations. Just a teacher, a group of children, and a long sequence of small lessons. Yet those quiet lessons help shape generations. The empire outside may have looked enormous. Its roads stretched across distant provinces. Its armies marched across borders. Its officials governed cities. Its merchants traveled across seas. But somewhere in the middle of all that activity, a child sat quietly scratching letters into wax. And tomorrow morning, that child would do it again. By now you have spent enough mornings inside the Roman classroom to notice something important. The children are not all learning in exactly the same way. Some move quickly through their letters. Others need much more repetition. Some seem naturally comfortable with numbers. Others stare at the counting board as though the little markers have personally offended them, and some children are simply better at paying attention than others. The teacher notices these differences too. But there is another difference that matters even more. Not every Roman child gets the same educational opportunities. Your classroom may contain children from families with very different circumstances. A wealthy family can afford to spend more on education. A modest family may have to think carefully about every expense. And a poor family may have very different priorities. For some children, school is only one part of life. For others, work and family responsibilities can come first. You look around the classroom again. The little wooden stools suddenly seem less equal than they appeared yesterday. Everyone may be sitting in the same room, but everyone has not necessarily arrived here by the same path. Roman society is strongly shaped by wealth, family background, gender, legal status, and social position. Education exists inside that society. It does not float above it. If you are the child of a wealthy Roman family, your parents may have greater ability to pay teachers and provide books, tutors, and additional instruction. You may continue your education for many years. If your family has fewer resources, your education may be shorter. You might still learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, but your path may end earlier. This is one of the quiet realities of ancient schooling. The classroom can teach children together, but society does not give them identical futures. You watch a student whose clothes are particularly fine. The fabric is better. The sandals are carefully made. Perhaps his family has servants. Another student wears much simpler clothing. Nothing about his ability to learn is necessarily different, but the opportunities waiting beyond the classroom may be. The teacher continues the lesson. He does not need to explain all of this. Everyone already understands the social world around them. Children grow up knowing that some families have wealth and influence while others do not. They see it in the streets. They see it in houses. They see it in clothing. They see it in the people who work for others. The classroom is simply another place where those differences quietly appear. There is also the question of girls. Education for girls in Roman society varies considerably depending on period, family, and social circumstances. Some girls receive education. Especially within wealthier households, girls may learn reading, writing, literature, music, or other subjects considered appropriate for their circumstances. But their educational path is generally not identical to that of boys. The expectations placed upon them are different. You imagine a girl sitting in a household learning to read while a brother attends lessons with a teacher. The two may both become literate, but the reasons their families consider education valuable can be quite different. A wealthy Roman girl might be expected to manage a household, correspond with others, understand family affairs, or participate in the cultural life of her social class. Education can help prepare her for these responsibilities, but she is still living inside a society where men generally hold greater public and political power. The classroom cannot completely erase that reality. You notice another important distinction. Not every child in the Roman world is free. Slavery is a major part of Roman society. Enslaved people have very different legal and social positions from freeborn children. Some enslaved children may receive education, particularly when their skills could benefit the household that owns them. An enslaved child might be trained as a reader, writer, secretary, tutor, or other skilled worker. That education could be useful to the household, but it does not automatically mean freedom. This is one of the uncomfortable contradictions of Roman education. Knowledge can provide skills. Skills can provide opportunities. But social status can still determine what those opportunities actually mean. You sit quietly and watch the teacher correct another student's writing. The scene looks ordinary. A child learns a letter. The teacher gives advice. The class continues. But behind the simple lesson stands an entire social system. The teacher himself has a position within it. His income may depend on students. His reputation may depend on the success of those students. He may teach children whose families have more wealth than he does, and yet inside the classroom, his knowledge gives him authority. You begin to understand that Roman education is full of these overlapping relationships. Teacher and student, parent and child, employer and worker, free and enslaved, rich and poor, boy and girl. The classroom sits at the center of all of them. The teacher calls for another reading exercise. A student stands. The words begin. You listen. For a moment, social differences disappear beneath the rhythm of the lesson. Every student has to recognize the letters. Every student has to pronounce the words. Every student can make mistakes. That small equality is real, but it has limits. The teacher finishes the exercise and moves on. You look at the children again. One of them will probably continue into more advanced education. Another may leave school sooner. One may eventually become a lawyer or administrator. Another may become a merchant. Another may work in a family business. Another may never have much use for formal education at all. The teacher cannot know exactly what future awaits each student. He can only teach them what is in front of him. And perhaps that is one of the most interesting things about ancient education. It is not a perfectly organized system designed to provide identical opportunities to everyone. It is a collection of schools, teachers, families, traditions, and expectations. Education depends heavily on where you live, who your parents are, what they can afford, and what they believe your future should look like. The Roman state does not create a modern universal school system in which every child must attend the same kind of institution. Instead, education is often organized through families and private teachers. That means the decision to educate a child can be deeply personal. A father may decide that his son needs a strong education because he expects him to enter public life. Another family may decide that basic literacy is enough. Another may need the child's help with work. The choices are shaped by practical reality. You watch the teacher move toward the next student. Another letter, another correction, another repetition. It is easy to focus on the lesson itself, but the bigger story is happening around it. Who gets to sit here? Who gets to stay? Who gets to continue? Who gets to use education as a path toward greater social influence? Those questions are just as important as the alphabet. The Roman classroom is therefore both a place of learning and a reflection of Roman society. It can open doors, but it cannot open every door for everyone. The afternoon light begins to soften. The students continue their work. You hear the familiar scratching of styluses. For a moment, everything seems ordinary again. And perhaps that is the point. History is often shaped not only by grand decisions, battles, and emperors, but by ordinary choices made every day. A family deciding to pay a teacher, a child being sent to school, a girl learning to read, an enslaved child being trained in a useful skill, a teacher deciding to repeat a difficult lesson one more time. Thousands of small decisions like these quietly shape the educational world of Rome. The teacher asks the class to begin another exercise. You settle back. The letters appear on wax. The voices rise. And once again, the ordinary rhythm of Roman education continues.